Welcome to Season 2 of the Simply Dynamic podcast. I'm Jennifer Maiden, co-creator and executive producer of this podcast, and the Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies at Rowan University's Rohrer College of Business. Today, I invite you to join our hosts, Joe Devine and Christina Renna, for a discussion with Michael Renna, President and Chief Executive Officer of South Jersey Industries, where he promotes New Jersey's vision of working toward a clean energy future while delivering safe, reliable, and affordable clean energy to over 700,000 natural gas customers.
Well, hello, and welcome to the Simply Dynamic podcast. Do you know why this is called the Simply Dynamic podcast, Christina?
Joe, why don't you tell me?
Well, it's great to have you as my co-host, the president and CEO of the Chamber, Christina Renna.
Thank you.
But it's a Simply Dynamic podcast, which we have dynamic leaders. We're talking about their leadership journey, how they've gotten here, and what their roles are in their current organizations, and some tips for our young leaders.
Quite frankly, the perfect name for the podcast, if I may say so myself.
So today's guest is someone you know and someone I know.
I know him.
So why don't you introduce him?
I mean, this guy to my left and straight across from you is Michael Renna, and he is CEO of South Jersey Industries, SJI, which we're going to learn about today. But I mean, most importantly, married to me. How does that make you feel?
Oh, is this directed at me now?
Yes, you're the only Michael Renna.
Well, first of all, whenever I hear Michael, I'm in trouble. So when I do something,
just trying to be formal.
I see. So yeah, this is very exciting. I'm really looking forward to it.
So Mike, you're a great leader, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you today, and it's part of our podcast series. And we know you do something that's kind of unique, but I wanted to talk a little bit about your career journey. I happen to know, of course, you were a college football player, an NFL player. Why don't you talk to us quickly about how you got to where you are today?
Wow, it's a long time. All right. Well, so yeah, I grew up in Jersey. I went to the University of Delaware. I did have an opportunity to play professional football for a couple of seasons before actually going back and getting my MBA. Worked up in the Buffalo area for M&T Bank for a couple of years, and then moved down here. And I've been with SJI since 1998. So
wow.
It's been quite a journey. It's been a great company for me in terms of opportunities it's provided me in my career. But I think more so just kind of the natural support that SJI has provided and provides all of its employees. It really does sort of feel like a family. And it's, I think more than anything, biggest part of my journey was really never looking anywhere else once I was at SJI.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, because obviously you were in that role and you had the opportunity to become the CEO. So that's a great accomplishment. Christina, what'd you like to ask Mike since you haven't asked him at home?
I mean, listen, maybe I'll find out something new and exciting today. I mean, it's all very exciting, but I think your career path is interesting because obviously you were, the youngest CEO in SJI history when you assumed that role about 10 years ago, almost a decade now. We talk a lot on this podcast about mentors, role models, and, growing up, your father worked in energy, you're working in energy. Would you call him one of your role models? And if yes, great. And also, are there any others that you would say off the top of your head?
Yeah, I mean, without question, my father has been the biggest influence on me personally and professionally. There is nobody I admire more in this world outside of
Christina, of course.
Present company excluded, everyone.
So you weren't talking about me, I'm assuming.
No, no, the whole room. But look, my father was very successful. And I think what was really inspiring about my father and what I aspired to be was to follow his path, right? He, in many ways, epitomized the American dream. He grew up largely without a father. His father had struggles with alcoholism. My father, sort of bore the responsibility of being the man of the house. It was a football scholarship that afforded him the opportunity to go to college. So he went to Rutgers. He had a very successful football career there, was an academic All-American, used that opportunity and that education to then go and get his MBA, all while starting a family. So I was born while my father was finishing up his graduate studies at Cornell, began a career at Mobil Oil that took him all the way to the board of directors in his mid-40s and to president and COO of Mobil Oil right up until the time they merged. So my father was about 6 months away from being CEO of Mobil Oil when they merged with ExxonMobil. And I think, what was most important about and why I admire my father so much was not only the career he built, but the way he went about doing it, right? He was always known as someone who was really talented at developing people and leaders underneath of him. And it was something that he was really committed to, and something I learned a lot from him is how important that was. And I think the other thing about my father was his family always came first. My brother and I were both very active in sports. As I said, my father played college football and was very active in sports. I don't remember a time, unless my father was traveling overseas, where he was not at a game. Right. And if that meant a high school basketball game at 8 o'clock at night, he took the train home from New York into Princeton. I grew up in the Princeton area, and he'd be sitting in the stands in his suit, eating a hoagie, right, just so he could be there and watch his sons compete. And I think that was really what I admired most about my father, and continue to this day. Other inspirations and I had a lot of great coaches over the years that I think, more than anyone professionally, I think it was the coaches that really helped to kind of shape both who I am as a person, but also, more importantly, I think my leadership and my leadership approach.
That was a question I was going to ask you. How did athletics and what you've done in your career impact your leadership approach? What do you think it brought to the table? Because sometimes some of our greatest leaders are people who've been through those fields.
Look, I think it's really two things, right? It's the intangibles that I think shape your character as a result of being an athlete, and particularly a football player. And I'm not saying that it's not the same across other sports. I just think there's something a little bit different and unique about football. But it's the hard work, it's the tenacity, it's the pride, it's all of those things. It's all the hours you put in the weight room preparing for the season. And the season is, if in high school it's 9 games long, right? If it's in college, it's 11 games long. But you're basically preparing year round for football. It's the diversity. I think that, one of the things that's really unique about being a football player, particularly if you get to play beyond high school, is that the demographics of the locker room are really a very prolific opportunity for you to understand how to value differences, right? Because you come from all walks of life, and it gets even more, pronounced as if you have an opportunity to play professionally. But I think where I really learned the most about, or I think where football had the biggest impact on my leadership, was when I actually had an opportunity to coach. So in between that brief period of time I played professionally and when I went into graduate school, I had an opportunity to coach for a season at the Coast Guard Academy. And what I learned there was, I think, really great for a 25-year-old to learn, right? I'm sitting there with a bunch of these kids trying to teach them what I did. And I'm 6'4" and 250 pounds. And I'm trying to teach these defensive linemen that are probably 6 foot, 200 pounds, what made me successful, not realizing that we were different. And I wasn't necessarily helping them develop the skills that they brought to the table. I was trying to impose upon them my way of doing things. And I learned really early on, I just had that epiphany where I went, why am I teaching this kid that's 6 foot the swim move when he can't get his arm over the offensive lineman's taller than him? It's not going to work. And I should be teaching him something else. And that really helped, I think, prepare me for leadership, to realize that you have to be open and you have to find the talent in other people and know that it's going to be very different than yours, and figure out ways to develop it and enhance it, which, again, I think if anything, I'd like my legacy to be that was something that, kind of defined me as a leader.
That's great. So that's news to me, by the way, because I didn't know about the Coast Guard Academy. I have a son-in-law who's a graduate of the United States Coast Guard Academy, much later in life, but it's a whole different discipline up there. So you're right. It's not, he was an athlete, but a soccer player. And it's a great place. And obviously that's a valuable lesson, because we all learn those things, right? And they're such a disciplined environment. Even the fact that how you were able to comprehend what you need to do to make them successful meant a lot. So I appreciate that.
And I think that's one similarity you both have as leaders, because seeing Mike work every day at SJI and the team he's built and the years of evolution of the company, which we'll get into, and thinking back to your years, Joe, at Kennedy and then Jefferson, you always said to me from the day I met you, your number one priority was rising people up and making sure you were building a team and your team was your family. And that's very much how not to put words in your mouth, but I see it every day. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of when I look at Mike and Mike's incredibly successful professional careers, that everyone who works for him loves him. Yeah. And when you were at Kennedy, Jefferson, there was the same. And you definitely have that similarity. And I think it's helped the evolution of the company into what it is today, which is a very different company than it was in 1998 when Mike joined the company.
Sure.
So I don't know, Mike, if you want to talk a little bit about SJI, not just who you are today as an organization, which is very different and looks very different than it was before you became CEO, but also where it was when you got in the door there.
Thank you. I love to talk about SJI. So first I'll start with who SJI is. SJI is an energy company. We own 2 utilities in New Jersey, South Jersey Gas Company, and then Elizabethtown Gas Company. And we've got a number of other businesses that are really focused on energy transition and renewable energy, which, if I have an opportunity, I'll talk a little bit about it later. But how different is SJI from now versus when I started 20 some years ago? And God, we could fill this whole podcast with some great stories. When I first joined SJI, you could still smoke in the building, which was really kind of.
I hate to tell you this, but when I started in the hospital industry, you could still smoke in the building.
I mean, it was crazy, right?
Near oxygen tanks, by the way.
we had no cubicles in the building, right? Everybody was still lined up in desks. It was like an old style, looked like an old classroom. It was all these big metal desks, and they were all lined up in a row. We had one computer per section of the room, and you'd have to sign a piece of paper to be able to access the printer. And it was very much of a traditional utility culture. I'll never forget my first day at work. I show up, and at 9:15, my boss comes up to me and goes, "Break time." I went, "Break time? What is this, Roseanne? What is break time?" And I kid you not, the entire company went down into the cafeteria and had coffee for 15 minutes because it was break time. And then at noon, it was like the whistle blew again, and we all went down for lunch.
Wow.
And then there was a 2:00 break that was optional. But no, I mean, every morning at 9:15, we had break. It's a very different company now. It is not an old school sort of, company. It's very much of a progressive company. It's been generations of new leadership and new ways of thinking, far more of a competitive mindset than a utility mindset, right? Part of, I think, what you see in utilities is because of the monopoly nature of a utility, lack of competition, it's very easy to get rigid and to think a lot about just process. And, quite candidly, it was a company and a culture that was dominated by accountants and engineers. And that typically was what you saw the majority of, except for the folks that were out in the field doing the really important work, right? The ones that were making sure that the system ran, that the leaks were taken care of, and whatever other issues that were going on, our first responders. Now, I think because the business is far more competitive and because it's far more dynamic, particularly with energy transition, which is in my 25 years at SJI, we've gone through 3 or 4 different very major inflection points as an industry. And so as a need to adopt to those and adapt to them, I think you see people, they have a very different mindset. And so now I would characterize SJI as what was once perhaps a very stoic and somewhat rigid culture. It is now, I think it's agile and it's very dynamic and it's very innovative. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of at SJI, and I think this is a real testament to how different we are, is, and it's going to sound really silly kind of coming from a utility, right? But we have been on the front end of every major innovative event in this space. And by saying that, I mean, it's not that the way you deliver energy has changed, but it's the way that you bill your customers, or the way that you value service, or it's the way that you look to decarbonize the energy that is going through your pipes. All of those things, SJI has been one of, if not the first, to really, again, I think, successfully innovate in our space.
What is all this talk about clean and renewable energy for the average business person or the consumer? What does that actually mean? Because people get confused about what that means.
I think let's start with just from a natural gas utility perspective. It started with the modernization of our systems, right? Replacing a lot of the aging infrastructure. You got to remember, a lot of us have been around for 100 years.
Right.
And some of that pipe in Philadelphia, some of that pipe is wood.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of it that we had in our system, particularly in areas like Vineland, right? The older, more urban areas of our system, or most of Elizabethtown, right? I mean, it's Elizabeth and Union and Westfield. Most of it was cast iron and bare steel. And it was approaching 70, 80 years old. We've replaced, under a very aggressive replacement program, we've replaced that older, aging, vintage pipe with new modern plastic. So that was the first thing, dramatically reduced leak counts. That has a huge environmental effect because one of the biggest greenhouse gas, I think, concerns is just fugitive methane, right? Just methane that's organic waste or other forms of methane that just get up into the atmosphere. Well, leaks in the system are one way that happened. But by modernizing our system, we've brought our leak counts down into the single digits. Incredible. They've spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars doing it, but it's had a huge impact in terms of safety, reliability, and then ultimately the environment. The other way that we do it as a gas utility, this idea of the energy transition, decarbonization, clean energy, is there are opportunities for us to blend lower carbon fuels with the geological natural gas to bring down the carbon intensity of the natural gas.
I'm going to interrupt my husband and say, he loves this. Go ahead, honey. I don't want to cut you off. I just said interject the excitement.
Two main, one is hydrogen, right? And we're it's a very nascent space right now, but green hydrogen, you can take the intermittent power from, like, say, a windmill. We were talking about storage a little bit before the podcast, right? You could take the intermittent power off of a solar facility or wind, you run it through an electrolyzer, and you literally take water and you split the hydrogen from the oxygen, and the hydrogen becomes an energy source. And it's green because there was no carbon used to create that hydrogen, right? But the other one is renewable natural gas, which is the one that we're heavily invested in, which is where you take organic waste, wastewater treatment facilities, landfills, agriculture waste, and you run it through an anaerobic digester or a treatment skid, and basically you create pipeline quality natural gas that could be safely blended with the geological natural gas and significantly bring down the carbon intensity of the gas that's used to cook your food or heat your homes. We're one of, if not the largest companies in the RNG space. We've got, I talked about innovation before, we've got one of the largest portfolios of actually dairy farms in the country, where we're taking the cow manure and we're running it through an anaerobic digester, and we're creating pipeline quality natural gas that's displacing geological natural gas.
Wow, that's really interesting.
And the other one that we're going up tomorrow for a groundbreaking is SJI will own and operate the largest food waste RNG facility in the entire country. It's almost a $500 million project that we're doing up in Linden, New Jersey. That gas will be directly fed into the Elizabethtown system and, again, displace geological natural gas.
So the summary of all you're telling, which is great innovative stuff that's going on, but at the same time, for your customers and for those people who know of you, you're doing as much as you can to make it clean energy and to minimize the cost for the consumer by giving them the best outcome.
Absolutely. And utilizing the infrastructure that exists, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the best part about it. Is one of the ways where I think SJI has really differentiated itself is we don't consider ourselves a natural gas utility. We think of ourselves as an infrastructure company.
Gotcha.
And we are agnostic as to what the molecules are that are going through the pipes, as long as they're pipeline quality and they're providing critical energy, right? So again, if it's blending in renewable natural gas, if it's blending in hydrogen, anything we can do that can bring down the carbon intensity of that energy stream, we're all for it. And we're making billions of dollars of investments to do that.
That's great information.
And I have learned so much because it's a very complex industry. And I've learned so much from talking to Mike and seeing what SJI is doing. But you should have seen my face when he told me a few years ago, like, we're looking to buy cow farms.
See?
And I looked at him like he was a crazy person. And I said, I don't understand. I mean, you love it and you'll go visit, and he has to come home and jump in the shower immediately. But that being said, it's really fascinating. All kidding aside, it's fascinating. Tremendous. I know when Mike talks about it so much and so passionately, because they are ahead of the curve in doing a lot of this. And I've learned a tremendous amount. And the RNG project was what I was going to talk about. The largest and first of its kind in the state for a company like yours?
It's certainly the first of a kind in the state. So New Jersey passed legislation a couple of years ago that requires large producers of food waste, universities, hospitals, other, food processors, which we have a pretty big food processing industry down in southern New Jersey, to separate the food waste from traditional waste. New York City now mandates that all the way down to the residential level. So residents in New York City have three trash cans. They've got a regular trash can, they've got a recyclable trash can, and now they have one for food waste as well.
Wow.
That food waste, when our plant is built, we'll have 8 digesters, and it will take food waste from the large producers in New Jersey And the majority of the food waste that through the 5 boroughs of New York will be trucked to our Linden project, and it'll be converted into energy. And again, it'll ultimately be pipeline quality gas that will be injected right into the Elizabethtown system and directly serve. And it's actually cost neutral. So that $500 million project is going to deliver cleaner energy to the Elizabethtown customer base, and it's cost neutral to them.
No, this is a great topic for some of our business school people as well in this at Rowan University, because people don't understand this, business leaders of the future. So I want to pivot a little bit to leaders.
Sure.
What are the biggest challenges leaders have today from your perspective, not just in your industry, but as you see fellow colleagues? What are some of the challenges that are out there today?
I think it all comes down to culture.
Mhm.
Right? It's always a challenge to build a culture, to get it to a point where you think it's high performing and high functioning and sustainable. And then it's just as hard to build it as it is probably to sustain it, right? And that comes down to making sure you hire the right people, which is never easy, right? No one bats 1,000. Going to make mistakes in terms of who you hire, but you have to have the kind of culture that identifies that and reacts to it, and certainly gives people the benefit of the doubt and takes the opportunity to try to develop them. But in the end, if it's not a fit, I think you do not only the company, but that individual a disservice if you don't find a gracious way to sort of,
Sure.
exit. But I think culture is the biggest challenge. And we're at a really unique point, right? We've got multiple generations of workers in the workforce right now. Everything, what are they now? Gen Z, Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
All the way up to, you still have baby boomers.
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got, you want to talk about wildly different priorities and approaches and thought processes. Getting a company to be able to navigate through that, I think is one of the great challenges. The other challenge I will say is that, especially in my space, but I think it's probably relevant to most, and particularly, things like healthcare and some of the other more heavily regulated spaces, is that we're in such a interesting time politically that it just invariably has an impact on how you conduct and operate your business, right? I mean, whether it's regulatory pressures or even legislative acts, and there's not consistency, right? So you look at a company like mine, which its roots are in 90% of our business is in New Jersey. Well, New Jersey policy can be very, very different than federal policy.
Sure.
And we've got to figure out how to thread the needle and manage through both. So I think for us, a big part of what we are challenged by now is making sure that we're anticipating what's coming, that we're not reactive to it, that we're proactive. And I think, again, that's kind of why I go back to how SJI is different and how we've redefined who we are. Right? We recognized pretty early on that there were a lot of headwinds in this space when it came to natural gas and fossil fuels in general. And we're looking to get out ahead of that and to not only change the way that we do business, but change our brand.
Sure.
To me, those are the two biggest challenges, right? Are just, one is your culture and the other is the things you can't control.
Yeah, that's why I'm glad you put up the different generations, because obviously I'm of one and my co-host is of another, but the dynamic is unique.
And I'm in between.
Right, but the dynamic is, you're right, the dynamic is unique because people have different perspectives and you learn from each other as well. And if you're willing to do that, it makes organizations like yourself successful.
One thing we haven't talked about is you're a dad and I'm a stepmother to 3 amazing children, 21, 24, 26 years old, especially the 2 older ones, because the 21-year-old is still in college, but the 2 older in the workforce right now, we're watching them start their careers and, immensely proud of them. What advice do you give aspiring leaders? And what do you give the boys? What do you tell, people starting off that want to get to a Mike Renna level one day?
Yeah, I mean, we are the proud owners of 3 Gen Zs. So what I tell them is that, look, everybody's career journey is going to be different. But I think the one advice that I would give to anyone, irrespective of where you are in your career, is take every opportunity you can to get out of your comfort zone. Take on that challenge, right? Look for opportunities. If that means even growing by moving laterally, take that opportunity as an opportunity to learn more about the business, to build your skill set. That, it's not always the traditional path, right? If you start thinking about just climbing the ladder completely vertically, I think you're going to miss out on opportunities and you're going to miss out on all that potential for growth, both for you individually, but also in terms of your career. Let it be a little bit of a
linear path.
Right.
No
linear path is the right way to put it. And you know what? I think if you step outside of your comfort zone, you'll find confidence in yourself that you probably didn't know existed. right? And that may be not only just the nonlinear career path, but it might be sit on a panel, especially if you don't like public speaking, right? I mean, I hated it. I was awful at it. And now I think I've become pretty good because I forced myself to do it.
Well, I'll just interject and say, well, 10 years ago, a decade ago, no one was doing podcasts. But if we were, Mike Renna would have never done a podcast 10 years ago. I mean, and I say
Right.
that, this was very much outside your comfort zone doing something like this. And now it's not.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt. And I see that in both our boys who are working is that they are willing to get outside of their comfort
That's
zone.
great.
And they're willing to take on that challenge, right?
But the good news is you could be quiet at home because you have somebody you live with who's not afraid to talk most of the time.
She is an awesome wingman. I swear. When I used to go do these networking events, I was like, "You're coming with me."
I've had the great opportunity, to
Yeah.
work with her at the chamber, and she's just dynamic. So I always thought the best CEO, and I was always told the best CEO in the Renna household was Christina. But boy, I've learned a lot today, and the dynamics are pretty interesting because obviously you're both very successful at what you do. And you have to make time for each other, which is important, but you've made time for your family. And most importantly, Mike, thanks for making time for us today.
I really enjoyed it.
Because this is an important for leaders. The whole concept behind this is to bridge the gap between academia and reality. And what you've talked about today is a lot about reality. And I thank you for your time today. And I'm going to let Christina wrap it up.
No, I just thank you for doing this. And, for me and my perspective, I'm always a very proud wife whenever I get to hear you do things like this. So it was kind of fun to be a witness of it. So
well, she is the boss. And maybe one day I can sit in that seat and we could put her here and you and I
like that. That's actually a pretty good idea.
Think that would be great.
She was, yes.
Sounds pretty terrible. Okay.
I hope you enjoyed that chat as much as I did. What was your key takeaway from this discussion? Share it on our social media channels at Simply Dynamic Podcast. Next up, in our Fresh Perspective segment, established leaders and early career professionals will share insights and ideas on the differences between military and civilian leadership.
So there's a lot of different aspects between military and civilian leadership. I would say that the largest aspect that's different between the two is that in military leadership, you're much more directive than you are suggestive. As a civilian leader, I think you're trying harder to get your subordinates to come to the conclusions on their own, whereas in the military, you are telling your subordinates what to think. And that can create a lot of conflict for someone who is transitioning out of the military in their relationships with civilian employees. Things that are the same are still the fact that you need to be a servant leader, and then you have to have some kind of empathy for your subordinates. There are a lot of challenges in transitioning between being a military leader and a leader in a civilian company. As a military leader, you are empowered to do whatever it is that you want with your subordinates within reason, where in civilian leadership, you have to temper the expectations of not only yourself, but your team. A lot of veterans go into corporate America, and there's a stigma attached with being a military leader. There's a lot of sitcoms where a substitute teacher shows up and he's a former drill sergeant, and we all see how these things go. But that carries over to corporate America. And I think as a military leader making that transition, you have to combat that and make sure that your employees and your team know that you are a different leader wearing a suit and tie than you are wearing a set of fatigues.
This is a topic I discuss often. What I struggle with is the type of leadership style. In the military, it's transactional. You're either given orders, taking orders, and that is it. It's a one lane. With working at Comcast Business and Contract Management, it's a more collaborative environment. You're leaning on each other's strengths and each other's weaknesses. It's more of a discussion style leadership. And at the end, you make a decision together versus, like I said, in the military, it's transactional. You're either given or taking orders. And that's something that I feel most military members that work part-time in the military, full-time in the civilian side do struggle with, that the difference in that leadership style. But I think overall, what makes that stronger for military members in the civilian side is you can take direct orders. You're not taking personal offense to that. I do oftentimes see that also with the civilian side. So leadership style, collaborative in the civilian side versus transactional in the military.
So when it comes to leadership development in the military, one of the things that they prioritize is developing instincts. you'll really see that as part of the mechanism for training across all the branches of service. It's about putting service members in an environment that's uncomfortable and seeing how they cope with it, seeing how they adapt and adjust. And over the long term, consistently, that just helps develop instincts and helps give them experience to reflect on and to judge challenges going forward. So when you are trying to bring that over to the civilian world, that may not be facilitated by your organization, but you can kind of pursue that route yourself by raising your hand for stretch assignments, looking for work outside of your current function. And that'll just let you see how the business operates at different levels and see how your organization handles problems at different levels, further increasing the instincts you have to lean on when you're a leader. Colin Cox, Senior Financial Analyst at Lockheed Martin, 2020 Rohrer College of Business, Master's in Finance graduate.
Amelia Gonzalez, member of the New Jersey Army National Guard, Warrant Officer, Contract Administrator, Comcast Business, Rowan MBA Alumni 2023.
Zachary Rujas, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant, a combat veteran, and an Abrams tank commander. Environmental Sustainability Specialist at Integra Life Sciences, Rohrer College of Business MBA Fellow 2023, and a Rowan University MBA Alumni 2024.
In each episode of the Simply Dynamic podcast, we like to close out with an action-oriented tip from an expert that you can implement in your workplace. Today's expert tip comes from Jerry Maginnis, an executive in residence at Rowan University and the author of Advice for a Successful Career in the Accounting Profession, which is based on his decades-long success as an accounting executive.
So my tip today has to do with the importance of reading. We live in a world where social media has become increasingly dominant. We all spend probably way too much time on social media, and while you can get a lot of useful information there, sometimes it's hard to get beyond the headlines and the bite-sized pieces of info. Reading involves a deeper dive into knowledge and learning, hopefully something that's relevant to your profession and your area of focus. Successful people read, and there's a very high correlation between reading and success in business and in life. Bill Gates reads 50 books a year. Elon Musk, when asked, "How did you learn how to build rockets?" famously said, "I read books." Oprah Winfrey's an avid reader. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, reads 6 newspapers before he goes to work in the morning. If you want to be successful, spend significant time reading. Read on your field and profession, and read on leadership topics. It'll make you a better leader. Jerry Maginnis, certified public accountant and executive in residence at Rowan University's Rohrer College of Business.
Thank you to all of our guests for joining us today, and thank you, our audience, for listening to the Simply Dynamic podcast. This podcast is a collaborative project led by the Graduate Studies team at Rowan University's Rohrer College of Business in partnership with our hosts, Joe Devine and Christina Renna, and with support from producer and creative director Keith Brand, a professor in Rowan's radio, television, and film department. Music from this episode came from Epidemic Sound and Renku Corporation, recorded in collaboration with nonprofit partners. To learn more about the Simply Dynamic podcast, visit simplydynamicpodcast.com. Until the next episode, take care, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.